Hi, I'm Amy Rose, and with me today is Jeremiah Moss, who, as I'm sure you heard, is the author of Vanishing New York. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Cool.
Thank you, Strand and Nancy and everybody for being here.
So, for those of you that don't know, Jeremiah's blog, Vanishing New York, is what ultimately led to this book. And Jeremiah, do you want to tell us a little bit about how the blog got started and what you wanted to do with it?
Sure. You know, in some ways I wish I had a better story for this. It was kind of like, well, I wrote a little novel meaning a novella, and about a character named Jeremiah Moss. And he lives in East Village, and he's sort of grieving the changes of the neighborhood and his life as he's turning 40. And when I finished the first draft of that, I found that it was really cathartic to be writing that, and I wanted to keep going. So I was sitting on my bed one night and looking at other blogs, and I thought, you know, why don't I do that, and I'll put it in the voice of this character who's my voice, but a sort of different angle on my voice. And I just started the blog, and it was really, you know, it was really more for me. I hoped that a few people would read it, but it was really a personal thing in a lot of ways. You know, I had photographs of places that had already vanished and some journal entries, and I thought I would just put them together and see what happened. But there wasn't, I guess the reason I say I wish I had a better story is there wasn't a lot of thought. I didn't put a lot of thought into it.
Cool. Well,
Yeah.
I'm glad that impulse led into this. That's so great. Can you tell us about the first entries?
The first entries, yeah. My first entry was about, actually, ironically enough, a chain restaurant, Howard Johnson's, in Times Square, and then Chumley's, which collapsed and then has been reborn as Chumley's, but not really Chumley's. And a lot of the first entries were more, again, from journal entries, or I would take information from newspapers, and it wasn't a lot of my own writing in terms of the reporting. And then it became more and more going out and seeking things out and reporting on that. I think the first one that got a lot of attention was the Playpen, which was an adult spot on 8th Avenue in the 40s, which was in an old vaudeville theater, which has been torn down and replaced by a big glass box. So in that theater was the Playpen, and then the Funny Store, which sold whoopee cushions and rubber chickens and this kind of thing. And so I would sort of like lurk around there, and then as they demolished it, I would go back and take pictures of the demolition and all of that. So that was the first one that really kind of got more attention, I think.
What do you think it is about those Times Square theaters that draw people in so much? Because I know that from your blog, you wrote about a theater called Follies, which I think was replaced by a souvenir store. So, but the theater is still there underneath the store. It's like this huge souvenir store, like statuettes of Statue of Liberty. I went for a year and asked them to let me down there. And eventually they did.
They did.
They did.
They hate when people go down there, yeah.
They let me now. Like, I'll
That's
go
great.
back and say, hey, and they'll say, oh, yeah.
Is it still there?
Yes, it's all still there. They stack I Love New York t-shirts on the theater seats. It's incredible.
Right.
So thank you for that. But yeah, what is it about those places that you think people have such a connection to?
It's a good question. You know, I've been thinking about that as I've been watching The Deuce on HBO, because there's a lot of nostalgia for the 70s and for that grit and that wildness and the sex and the sort of openness of that time. You know, a lot of people think that, people ask me if I were to go back to any era, what would it be? And they all assume it's the 70s. It's not. I would probably choose post-World War II era. That would be my favorite New York. But people sort of peg me as this 1970s sort of fetishist or something, which is not really accurate. But, you know, we're in this moment where there's a lot of excitement about looking at old photographs of the 70s and of Times Square in particular. And I think, you know, I think it's a reaction to this sterilization that we're all experiencing in the city, and the homogenization, the sterilization. Everything is so clean, and there's something about cleanliness that, you know, dirt, as I say in the book, dirt is fertile, and so it also, I think, reflects, you know, I was thinking, we all have dirty corners inside of us, and if we're living in a world that doesn't reflect that, it can make you feel really alien about your dirty corners.
Yeah.
Right?
I feel that.
Yeah, you get
for
that?
sure.
Right.
And if you can't, I don't know, you want to feel alien in New York, but not quite in that way.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
So
right.
before we talk about what we've cleaned up, I'd like to know what we've lost. Why is it that you chose the 40s, the post-war 40s, as your favorite
Why would I
era?
choose that time?
Yeah, if that typifies
Yeah.
New York at its best.
Yeah, yeah. I think it was a time when you had this, confluence of a lot of the pieces that made up what I think of as the soul of New York. So when I talk about, how the great city lost its soul, I'm really talking about the working class, bohemians, LGBT people, So at that time you had the Beat movement, you had the New York School of poets and abstract expressionist painters. You had a strong working class, a strong labor movement, and New York City was becoming a social democracy, and that reflects a lot of my values. And New York's always been an expensive city, but rent was low enough that you could change your apartment, you could move around, and there was space to make a living in lots of different ways, and that's something we've lost, right? Mm-hmm. If you are hustling to always make the rent, you can't really take risks. You can't take professional risks. You can't take creative or sexual risks. You can't take political risks. And so that was a time when you could take risks.
Yeah, and I want to talk about a risk that you were constantly taking in writing this blog and then this book, which was writing under a pseudonym and having to preserve that anonymity while you were also doing things like starting Save NYC, which is an amazing community initiative that brought people together in physical spaces. So I'd like to know a little bit about what felt important to the process to have a pseudonym. Why did you choose to keep that for so long?
Again, that's a question I wish I had a more interesting story for. I really kind of fell into it. A pen name is kind of a convention of blogging, especially when I started. And I was working at the time as a social worker at a clinic. I was also doing copywriting on the side to make ends meet. And I just thought, I'll do this. I'll put it in the name of the character in the book and have it be a sort of just like little bit of a separate space for me to not have to think about, will this affect my job or anything else? And then it really took on a life of its own, and I found that it gave me a lot of space. It gave me a lot of psychological freedom and emotional freedom to write from a position of, I think a lot of times when I talk about things, I really want to get all the nuances. And as Jeremiah, I didn't have to be nuanced. I could say, this sucks, this is good, I hate this is bad, this is wrong, without having to do all the work that I usually do. So it gave me that. And then I became very attached to it. I became attached to the experience of sort of sneaking around the city and being in a space and knowing that nobody knew who I was, sometimes hearing people talk about me without knowing I was there. I would go to events like with Save Cafe Edison when we were trying to save that. I and a group on a Facebook page organized all these lunch mobs. And I went to the first one. In my disguise, I would wear a Boston Red Sox baseball cap because I figured nobody's ever going to think that Jeremiah would show up in a Red Sox cap. So that was nobody looked at me. It was great.
Or if they did, it was with utter disdain.
Exactly.
Got it. So I'm curious about the structure that you chose for this book, because the blog is purely, for the most part, based in particular locations, different businesses. So I think an easy way to have done this would have been like, oh, here's a photo of this business and the history of it. Why instead did you choose to write this part memoir, part history document? And why did you structure it the way that you did?
Well, I didn't want to just duplicate the blog on paper. I thought that would be incredibly boring. And I wanted to, as I was writing the blog over the course of several years, I was constantly asking myself this question: what is different about the change we're seeing today, right? Because what I hear a lot is New York is always changing, which is true, but there was another level of change, there was another depth of change, and I was trying to understand that. And I'm also a psychoanalyst, so I was really interested in, the changing psyche of the city, and I wanted to get that in too. And so I wanted to be able to understand and then explain really what was happening, looking under the surface of things. And when you're just saying, this closed and this is why, you're not really getting under the surface of it. It's really just, a picture and a snapshot. And this book was really hard to sell. Nobody really wanted it. It was really hard to find an agent. It was hard to find an editor. And I didn't want to write it initially. I mean, I was trying to publish novels, and people that I was asking advice from kept saying, well, you have to write the Vanishing New York book. And I was like, I just didn't want to do it. I don't know why. I just wasn't interested. And then I realized, well, maybe this is what the world is wanting, or people are wanting from me, and they're not wanting these other things, so I better just do it. So, did I answer your question?
I think you answered some things, but I'm really happy that you did write this, because it's my favorite book of the year.
Oh, thank you.
So if this is the thing that you didn't want to write,
I didn't want to write it. No.
I'm so glad that you did.
I really didn't. And like I said, people didn't want it. So what people wanted was, they wanted like the book that sits by the cash register in the bookshop, that has a picture of a place and a little vignette about why it closed, or what it meant, or what it was. And that felt really flat to me. So I really wanted to get into the history stuff.
What surprised you as you were researching this book? When you say you were uncovering things and finding out the why behind the history of New York that you knew, was there anything that you were really shocked by, or really not expecting?
I think the big sort of discovery for me that tied the book together and gave me the answer that I was looking for was neoliberalism, which is my favorite thing to talk about that a lot of people hate.
Let's tell the people what it is.
Okay. Neoliberalism, right? So this is a word that is sort of fraught, that if you're not familiar with it, it's hard. It has a slipperiness to it. Even when you learn it, it slips out of your head. So it's not new and it's not liberal. And the way that I think helps to remember it is that the word liberal in neoliberalism means to liberate the market, to liberate banks, to deregulate the marketplace, and that's really where that comes from. People outside of the United States don't have a problem with this word, but in America, where liberal means left, it just gets confusing. So basically, neoliberalism is this economic philosophy and set of policies that came about in the mid to late 1970s and really got rolling with Reagan and Thatcher in the UK. And it basically means deregulation, deregulating industry, deregulating banks, deregulating corporations. So it's why we have fracking, it's why we have pollution, it's why we have global warming. Privatization, so taking public resources away from the public and putting them in the hands of private corporations. It means believing in that technocrats, that billionaires know best. It's a large part of why Trump is the president and why he's choosing billionaires to run everything. What else is it? And it has this underlying belief about humans, right? That humans are basically selfish and greedy and competitive. And so it's really this sociopathic system. And it has become the air that we breathe. We don't know it's there. We don't really pay attention to it often, but it's really gotten into our heads. And I think about it as a thought virus, and it propagates through memes, and memes like it's always been this way. There is no alternative, and what's the other one? This is natural. Yeah, this is natural. Yeah. This is just how it is, yeah. And you can't interfere with the market. The market is interfered with constantly. Right.
I think of it too, it's Thatcher saying there's no such thing as the society.
Right.
It's the idea of trickle-down economics, the fake idea of the meritocracy.
Yes.
Everybody is their own island, and you have to buy and sell accordingly.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
So, okay, when did this come up in your research? At what point was this introduced to your thinking about New York?
It's a good question. I'm not sure. I have a good friend who is an urbanist and Professor Julian Brash. He wrote a book called Bloomberg's New York, which I recommend. And he and I went to college together. And he would talk about neoliberalism as an academic, and I could never understand what he was saying. So I started reading about it, and I started looking for really basic sort of explanations of it. And the more I read about it, the more it was like that moment of, the veil lifts away and you suddenly see, oh my God, all of this is connected. It kind of like all comes down to this. I mean, that's an oversimplification in a lot of ways, but you start to see the gears in the big machine. And that's what happened for me.
Yeah, and I think of the way that it's concentrated too in the mayors of the second half of the 20th century. Do you think that this started with Coke when this really accelerated and became Koch?
Yeah. It came out
I'm
of
26. Sorry.
You're 26, and thank you for loving this topic in this book, because I feel like we need more people in their 20s who care about this stuff. So the neoliberalization of New York happened in the it came out of fiscal crisis, right? So New York was in fiscal crisis in the mid-1970s, and the solution, right, which was New York was becoming this social democracy, and conservatives didn't like this, and the elites didn't like this, and the Wall Streeters didn't like this. So they basically had what some call a coup. They took over the government of New York City, and they instituted neoliberalism for the first time in the United States. So it really was patient zero for this new virus, and this is where it really started in the Western world. And what that looked like was austerity. So cutbacks in public services, the closing of public hospitals, tuition at CUNY that we didn't used to have to pay tuition at CUNY. Cutbacks, so firehouses closing, police being laid off, teachers being laid off, all of this cutting back. So you have that, and then you have this redistribution of money away from public services to a huge budget for tourism. So tourism is a big part of this plan. And then massive infusions of corporate welfare for developers, corporations, tons. We're talking about billions of dollars over the years. Donald Trump I really believe he wouldn't be the president without the neoliberalization of New York City. He built his empire. We're talking about $800 million in money from taxpayers for Donald Trump to put up luxury towers. And that's how he built his fortune.
Right, and it really did that is when poor New Yorkers were really relegated outside of Manhattan. I think of that story in your book about the cocktail party,
right.
Where Koch is quoted as saying, the poor don't have to live in Manhattan. There are other boroughs where they can go.
Yes.
So it was this active disregard, in your
right.
opinion.
Right.
Okay,
Absolutely.
and then, so how did that go from there in the 80s and 90s? What was the progression of that?
So the progression of that was, Reagan becomes a president, and this becomes national policy. Mm-hmm. He also took a lot of money out of cities. So cities at that point, right? So there's a lot of this that really comes out of the racism and the racist public housing policy from the federal government, really starting with redlining in the 1930s. So that's somewhat of a lot. I'm sort of kind of thinking like how much of that to go into, but you have redlining, and then you have suburbanization and white flight, which were really socially engineered, right? It really was about disinvesting from the city as the city was getting blacker and browner and poorer. And what was happening was that African Americans were denied these federal loans that went only to white people. And they were, white people were moving out to suburbs that had whites-only covenants. So even if you were a black family and you had the money to buy a house in the suburbs, you were banned. You couldn't do it. So what they did was they trapped African Americans in the city. They were migrating up from the Jim Crow South. So you can't go back to the South, right? Because that's dangerous. So you're trapped in the city, and you're redlined. So you're in these redline neighborhoods where you then can't invest. You can't get any investment. You can't buy property. You can't invest in a small business. So there's no wealth creation, right? And then you have Robert Moses coming in and bulldozing these neighborhoods that were functioning neighborhoods of color, working class neighborhoods of color, and you really have this, this takeover of the city. And so then when we get to the 90s and we have Giuliani, we have this vengeful government, and there was very much this sense of, we're going to get revenge on the black and brown city, and we're going to police it heavily, right? And this is when we get broken windows policing, and that comes out of the Giuliani administration. So that's the 90s, right? And throughout, from Koch through the 80s and 90s, gentrification is public policy. And gentrification is a way to make the city whiter and richer. That's really what it is. It's no longer this quote unquote natural process, right, that maybe it was in the 60s. It's now backed by the government.
Right, and that was enforced through business as well.
Through
small businesses being forced out at the same time.
Right.
Okay.
And we're dealing with that now, right? So one thing that a lot of people don't know, and something I found out as I was writing the book, is that New York City had commercial rent control after World War II for almost 20 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, right? Commercial rent, like you're same thing we have with residential rent control. So that was something that, I would say, like, when Bill de Blasio was running for mayor, he did this little Reddit Q&A thing, and I asked him a question about commercial rent control, and he said, we could never have commercial rent control in the city. That's basically like, it's going against the laws of the market or something like that. But that's that neoliberal kind of brainwashing. Like, we had it, we can have it again. There's no reason why we can't.
So do you think it's just lobbying that keeps him from
there's
considering
huge,
it?
Yeah, I mean, we need campaign finance reform. That is really the number one thing we need to change. And that's another thing. I went from like fighting for one business at a time. That doesn't work. We need policy change. And I'm thinking, like, policy change isn't going to happen until we have campaign finance reform, because we keep electing people who are in the pockets of the real estate industry.
Right. So at what level of local government do you think that people can begin to make a real push for that? Where do you think the weak points are that we need to be pressing if we can't go to the mayor?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I kind of like, I'm not a community organizer, and I'm really not very political. I'm not very politically savvy. So I think about it maybe more from my psychoanalyst brain, which is, I really, my job is to help people become conscious, and that's what I really want to do, and I think it really starts there. Really becoming conscious of knowing when your own mind is being taken over by these memes. And I catch myself, like with the commercial rent control thing. I thought, I can't even want commercial rent. How could I even dream about commercial rent control? That's madness. It's some kind of insanity, but it's not. So we all get tripped up in that. And so what I really want people to do, my fantasy, is that every time you hear somebody say, New York's always changing, this is natural, is to really have a conversation with them, because we have to deprogram ourselves and our friends and our families to understand that it hasn't always been this way, and there are alternatives. I think that's really the first step. Admit that we have a problem, right? Like, that's step one.
Yes, that's a good approach. So I want to talk about what is here that is so worth preserving still. I want to talk about the different parts of New York that to you still feel like they have the same personality of the New York that you've known. Where do you observe that?
Well, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind, and it's something that's vanishing, is my office building. So I have a private practice in a building across the street on 11th and Broadway, the St. Denis building. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It was a hotel in the 1800s. Abraham Lincoln, Mary Todd Lincoln, after Abe Lincoln was assassinated, went there in shame to, she stayed there because she was broke and she had to sell off her belongings. So it has this history, and then it turned into an office building in the early 1900s and hasn't been changed since. It's full of therapists and psychics and weirdos. There's a cat that wanders around. The Abraham Lincoln Brigade archives are there. There's a guy who has a little bookshop on the 3rd floor that only sells chess books about playing chess. And he has a cat too, of course. And the building was bought by developers, and we're all being kicked out. And I recently heard there's only 45 people left in the building of what was hundreds. And I love going to work in that building. It's shabby, and it smells funny, and it has like microclimates of odors as you move through the building. Because people are burning incense, and then there's this rot, right, that old buildings have that's kind of delicious and disgusting at the same time. And it's quiet. I can hear the bells of Grace Church tolling throughout the day. And I'm in the midst of grieving for this because I have to leave in 2 months, and I don't know where I'm going to go. So that's, I'm kind of getting to your question. But one thing I just want to say about that, too, is that, the fight for small businesses, we think about our storefronts, but as a small business person on an upper floor, we're being run out of this city left and right, and they're going to tear that down, and they want to put up another glass box. And there's not enough ornamentation on the outside for it to be landmarked. There's also a guy who runs an antique shop, this old guy. He sits out there with his shirt off almost year-round, and he also has a cat that sits on the sidewalk, and he's very crabby. And that crabbiness, I kind of love that New York crabbiness. I think it's important. So one thing that's vanished, do you remember Manganero's? Okay, so there were 2 women who ran Manganero's. It was there for over 100 years. It was an Italian place. And a lot of people hated those women. I loved them. But you would walk in, and they would look at you, and they say, "What do you want?" And you had to get past that. And once you got past that, you could sit down and complain about the mayor and the construction on the street, and they would tell you stories, and they would heap your plate with more pasta that you didn't pay for. They would just give it to you. And I had my 40th birthday party there, and they were wonderful. But that kind of people like to call me a curmudgeon, but I like that energy is really, that's authentic. It's not this Midwestern passive-aggressive nice thing that's seeping into the city.
I don't find it to be very nice at all.
The Midwestern nice, they call it?
Yeah, because it's violent. You know what I mean? Like the Midwestern nicety is it's what forces people out of their neighborhoods. It's like,
right.
Yeah, I don't see that as in any way like
You need the mic.
Oh, I'm so sorry. No, I'm just talking to my friend. No, I don't think it's nice. I think it's violent. And also, these are people who come in a lot of the time and expect for things to fit their expectation instead of trying to fit into their neighborhood. These are the people who are, calling the police on people who play dominoes on their sidewalk, as they have been doing for decades. I don't think that's very nice. I don't know. So this influx, when did you first start seeing this, particularly in the East Village? Because I know that NYU is a big focal point for that.
Yeah, I think, all around the same time, the late 90s. So I moved here in 93. So, there are a lot of people who would call me a Johnny-come-lately. This is fine. That's fine. I accept that. That's the New York way. I think the late 90s is when a lot of it started shifting in this way. Giuliani really policed the city into submission. And so crime rates were going down, which was happening nationally. Giuliani takes credit for that. He doesn't deserve credit for that. That was a national change, and there's a really interesting theory about Roe v. Wade and abortion that's connected to that. You can look that up. But that basically unwanted babies are more likely to commit crimes, and when you don't have a lot of unwanted babies, 20 years later, there are less criminals. So I would say around that time. And then Bloomberg, Bloomberg is the neoliberal mayor. He is the billionaire technocrat who knows best. And he rezoned 40% of the city. He upzoned and downzoned. So upzoning increases development, increases speculation. That was done mostly in black and brown, poor and working class neighborhoods where there are more renters. Downzoning preserves the neighborhood. That was done mostly in white neighborhoods where people own their own homes. So, and what's really interesting is if you look at the redlining maps from the 1930s and you look at Bloomberg's rezoning maps, they really kind of match, right? Because he upzoned in these neighborhoods that were disinvested. And then you look at a map of gentrification and it's a lot of the same areas. So we're still living with this legacy from redlining.
So we were talking about what people want from New York if they don't have those kinds of financial interests in them. Why do you think people are drawn to it here now if it's becoming increasingly chain-based, corporate, unaffordable? I mean, Union Square where we are, there's not one local business on actual Union Square, is there? On the perimeter?
I think they're all gone.
It's like Best Buy, Sephora. Yeah. So if it looks the same as everywhere, what do people want? If they're still renting, if they're
They
young?
want the same as everywhere. That's what people want. I'm not an advocate of high crime, but it kept out.
Just to clear that up.
People think I am. I'm not. But it kept out people who were afraid of the city, right? And other things kept out those people too. But a lot of people, not everybody, a lot of people coming to New York are bringing their suburban values with them. So I come from a small town in Massachusetts. I wanted to leave that place as far behind as possible. I wanted to become a city person. I wanted to be a New Yorker. And a lot of people coming, when you listen to them and you listen to them in interviews, they say that they don't like the city, basically. There was a thing in New York Magazine about Long Island City and this woman was like, I love living in this glass tower because I want to live in my own private hotel, and this is like my own private hotel. And they say things like, you don't ever have to leave the building. You don't have to interact with the street. You don't have to interact with the people. They actually say you don't have to interact with icky things. They say things like, I keep a car because I don't want to be a city person. And they love the chains, and they say they make me feel comfortable. Starbucks, IHOP, etc. Makes me feel like I'm back home. It makes me feel safe. It makes me feel like I'm in a familiar place. So there's an anti-urban quality to a lot of the people who are coming here now. And why are they coming? I don't know. You tell me.
Movies to be pioneers, to say, oh, okay, well, if I can make it here, I can make it anywhere, just like I always heard, from pop culture. I really do think it is like a self-aggrandizing thing if you don't come to New York for city person reasons. Did you want to say something?
I mean, I'm wondering a couple of things. First is, how do we turn, say, the hotel Dennis office building into policy? I mean, you say you're into policy. What can we do? Yeah.
I mean, people came here because they saw New York on Friends and Sex and the City. That's why these people are here. So
Yes.
how do we turn? I repeat. You heard my question. How? Then you can repeat.
Yeah. How do we do it?
Yeah.
Campaign finance reform, number one. We have to. I mean, I think it really starts there, because the policies will not listen. They will not listen to us. I mean, we're busting out. There are people busting their asses trying to pass the Small Business Job Survival Act. Small Business Job Survival Act, right, basically protects small business people, including upstairs, downstairs, people like myself, when it comes time for lease renewal that we will have arbitration to get a fair lease renewal. They won't pass it. The majority of the city council supports it. They won't bring it for a vote. City council speaker won't bring it for a vote. The mayor will not help. They won't do it. They won't do it. We need politicians who aren't working for big real estate.
Right. So what are 2 steps that we can do to bring about campaign finance reform?
I don't know. Does anybody know about campaign finance reform here? Who's some people working on this?
I'd love to hear ideas.
Constitutional convention? Yeah.
I actually ran for office.
Yes, tell us.
Great.
Yeah, the Constitutional Convention is actually the answer
What
to
is
that.
What is this?
The Constitutional Convention is coming up for a vote on November 7th, and there's a lot of scare tactics around voting no, but they're the same concepts that you would face with any democratic vote, is that we could lose certain rights, et cetera, et cetera. The last time the Constitution was changed was 80 years ago. A lot has changed, obviously, socially, culturally. A lot of reproductive rights things are still illegal in the state. Campaign finance reform issues. We could solve all these issues with a constitutional convention, which then is followed by voting on delegates, and then they propose ideas, and then we vote on those too. So if anybody's telling you that like the constitutional convention is scary because it's the end-all be-all, there's a long process that follows that, and it's uber democratic, and I advocate for it, and it can fix a lot of the issues of campaign finance reform.
I hear you.
Excellent.
I have a quick follow-up question for you, which is that I know this is really contentious. I know that people are basically split on this. What are the risks? What are people saying that the risks are? I know that you are very pro, but is there something to particularly look for if we are pushing for this that we also need to make sure we preserve?
I'm a big union person, and I have a lot of people who are fighting with me who because they're union leaders, are saying that it could put their pensions at risk. But literally any politician could put forth legislation to get rid of pensions. So the Constitutional Convention isn't the only avenue for that. I don't know the exact motivation, but I know it's generally, Constitutional Conventions generally swing more progressive as time goes on. So in 80 years, I think we would, the difference between 80 years ago and now, I think we would see a lot of good reforms, and a lot of the corruption in Albany, which stems from the real estate board in New York, and their sort of corruption is could be mitigated with the Constitutional Convention. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Yeah.
I just want to say there is a mom and pop shop in Union Square. It's called Rainbow. Oh, I'm sorry. There is a mom and pop shop in Union Square on East 17th Street off Broadway between 5th and Broadway. It's called Rainbow Falafel. They have been there.
That little
that's
place,
the
yep.
one.
Yep, good falafel.
Give them your cash.
Thank you.
That's something we can do. I think that is something to pay attention to as well. Is if we want places to survive, we also have to give them capital in their hands. That's like an immediate thing?
Yeah, I'm wary of that only
Okay.
because it's like I feel like it's like sharing something on Facebook. You know how you share something on Facebook and you think, I did something.
Right, it's a Band-Aid.
Right? It's
Yeah.
a Band-Aid. And it also, I think that it quiets down the part inside of us that feels guilt or responsibility or anger or an urge. It's kind of like there's something it's doing to our nervous system. So spending money at these places is absolutely important.
Okay.
But these places are driven out when they're doing very well and they're packed. I mean, all the time, So it's not the solution. And I'm just afraid of people getting lulled by the idea that they're doing enough.
Was that something that you found in your lunch mobs in that experience? And can you explain to us what the kind of initiatives that you were doing that were community-based were and what you learned from them?
Yeah. So with the Cafe Edison, we did the lunch mobs, which were great. They didn't need the business because they were doing great business. They were being put out by the landlord because there was no lease at that point. So there's just no protection at all. But what those did, I think, was bring attention to the issue. And that's again about raising consciousness. I mean, that's really where I go. I want to raise consciousness and make people aware of what's going on.
Cool. And I know that, for a while being anonymous, you couldn't do that in person, so you use social media to that effect. And, I know we just talked about when you post on Facebook, what does it really do? But you have huge communities surrounding your Vanishing New York pages.
Yep.
So what have you seen come out of that you think other people could take from and learn from in terms of people coming together and organizing online?
That's a good question. It's, honestly, it's been kind of a frustrating process because there is a lot of awareness that gets raised, and I tend to not be the most optimistic, sunny person. So
No.
I tend to be like, oh, this isn't, doing everything I wanted to do. It's really hard to get people off social media and get them to show up at things. Because again, I'm going back to neoliberalism, it induces apathy that's part of how it functions. It makes us feel powerless. And when we feel powerless, we don't show up, right? Because what's the point? What's the point in voting? What's the point in showing up for a protest? So we have to get angry. I mean, I really value the emotion of anger. I think it's really powerful and it's energizing, and we can use it, and we need more of it. So I want to make people angry.
That's interesting because, it's easy to be angry when you're looking at, say, your blog and you're looking at these beloved places closing. I mean, that's the physical proof and evidence, I guess. Which businesses have gotten the most response that you've posted about when they're closing? What do people really rally behind, and what do people feel that kind of apathy toward, do you find?
I think Cafe Edison was the biggest one.
Okay.
Because it was beloved by the Broadway community. It really got a lot of attention. Mm-hmm. People really love food, right? I'm kind of going back to Facebook. Like, you put up a picture of food, you get a lot of likes. If you put up a picture of like a sad dead elephant or something, nobody really likes it very much. No. So pair things with food. And people will show up, and they'll share. That's really, I don't know.
Okay, so are you still maintaining the blog now that you've written the book? Has that remained consistent for you?
I am. I'm posting less than I used to.
Mm-hmm.
Writing the book took a lot of energy to sort of siphon that particular kind of energy from me. I'll keep going. I want to write other things. I want to do other things. I'm not sure what quite yet. This whole post-book time has been like I haven't really settled to feel it or take it in yet. So once I'm through that, I'll know what's next.
How have you felt about the reception that the book has gotten, which has been fabulous? But I'm interested to know what you make of so many different critics bringing their approaches to New York out onto the page as really responses to your book.
Sure. The response has been mostly really positive. I got a kind of critical, I was going to use a different word, piece in the Daily News by a guy from the Manhattan Institute, which is a neoliberal think tank. And he basically called me a liar, which I didn't really appreciate. But there are people who are threatened by this stuff. They don't want us to wake up. They don't want us to realize that something can be done, and that this can be changed, and that this isn't just change as usual. So people have these responses, but mostly it's been pretty positive. Yeah. And
when we think about what can be changed, again, I think of how New York has always been a leader. New York is of course you say that when you live here, it's like part and parcel of being a New Yorker. But I wonder how we can prioritize social democracy in our own lives and in the broader New York. How can we push for that particular quality, which is, I think, what
this is an important point.
Everything hinges on.
Absolutely, because the social democracy that came into New York in the early part of the 20th century really spread, I think really spread from New York City. And then New York was, again, the first place where neoliberalism took hold in America. So as New York goes, I know, we're all sort of think that we're the number one city in the world, but as New York goes, maybe so goes the world. And so if we can sort of change New York, maybe we can change things out there. And I'm reading this book called Out of the Wreckage by George Monbiot, which I recommend. And he talks about the importance of story. And he talks about how, politics are driven by story, and that there was a story in the early part of the 20th century, which was social democracy is good, community is good, people are basically communal, people want to take care of each other, we should take care of vulnerable people. And then that story changed in the 80s to the neoliberal story, which I told you what that is. And what he's advocating for, and Naomi Klein in her book No Is Not Enough, which I also recommend, is advocating for, is a new story. We can't go back to, and we could sort of argue, this might have been the problem with Bernie Sanders was that he would want to kind of go back to the social democratic model, but that there has to be a new story, and we need to write that story. And what Monbiot is talking about is that story really is about cooperation, and what we're seeing here, seeing little inklings of cooperative owned land and cooperative owned buildings, and what happens when you do that, when you take property and you put it in the hands of people, and the people become the stewards of it for each other, and you take the real estate industry out of it completely.
If anybody has a question, if you want to raise your hand, I'll bring you the mic. We'll start in the front.
Hey, thank you for doing everything that you're doing. And I also want to specifically thank you for recognizing the racial component behind everything that we're seeing. I noticed that you bring up Koch, and then we kind of go into Giuliani, but there was a guy in between those two.
Yeah, Dinkins.
And I see him as sort of, when Barack Obama was elected, I wrote him an open letter, and I just said, please don't become David Dinkins, because David Dinkins brought us Giuliani, and I don't think he read it because I think it happened, So my question is, where do you see that do you see him as someone who attempted to push back against this, or do you see him as someone who just kind of went with the flow of the neoliberalism growth? Where do you see his place in this story?
I don't know. When I was doing the research for this book in terms of looking more historically and going through the mayors, particularly from Koch, there wasn't a lot about Dinkins, and there wasn't a lot about his impact on the gentrified city that I was writing about. So it's a kind of missing piece for me. Do you have... No, yeah, it's weird, I couldn't, and so there's a sense of he was just sort of ineffectual, or he didn't really have an impact. I don't think that's really true. Yeah. Giuliani takes credit for the Times Square redevelopment deal, but that was Dinkins' project.
He also planted the seeds of the NYPD expansion. He didn't drive that cultural change, but he definitely planted those seeds there and contributed to the crime decline.
Expanding the NYPD and the policing. Yeah, he's sort of
And he was a leader before he was mayor. He was a leader in Harlem with other black businessmen. He was doing things.
Thank you for bringing it up.
I've only read the introduction.
He's missing, and I don't really know where to fit him into it. Yeah, we'll work on it. All right, thank you. Yeah. Other questions or thoughts and statements that answer some of these questions? I'm open to all of that.
Hi, can you talk a little bit about the journey of the book through the agenting and publishing process?
The journey of the book through agenting, yeah. So I sent it out to a lot of agents, and they mostly, all of them said, New York book is too small, nobody's going to care, except for people in New York. And I thought, well, but if everybody in New York buys it, then that's really good, right? And my agent, who's wonderful, reached out to me. I was interviewed in the Daily Beast, and he saw the interview, and he reached out to me, and he's young and hungry, and he did a great job. We sent it out to, 15, 20 editors, and only 2 of them bit. One of them wanted me to write a book that was my top 10 favorite places that are gone. And I thought, "No, this is, I want to write an ambitious book." And so the editor who bought it, she really got it. And she came from indie publishing. She was at Harper, but she came from Soft Skull, I think. And so she had a kind of, political edge to her that I was allowed to write. I mean, I look at this, I'm amazed I got away with publishing this book. I don't quite know how I did it. I mean, there were people along the way who said to me, one of my favorite quotes is, "Instead of writing about Chinatown, why don't you write about Chinese bubble tea?" Or like, instead of writing about Little Italy, why don't you write about cannoli? So food, right? Like food really works. Yeah. But people didn't want a political book, but somehow it got through. Yeah.
Any questions further back? I know I've been up here a bit.
It's not really a question. I'm a native New Yorker. My dad was a native New Yorker, and he used to quote Mayor Jimmy Walker, who I think was a mayor in the 20s, perhaps, who was known to say, "New York is a great city if they ever finish it." And the change, New York always has been about change, but the change that it used to be was manageable. It was neighborhood. It was with respect to the people who lived there. And I really appreciate that the change you're writing about and railing against is anything but. So I just thought I'd add that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a really different kind of change, right? It's not, change is never really organic, but, like the example I often use is the Lower East Side. This was an immigrant neighborhood that was for 100 years accessible to one group of immigrants after another. And that's constant change, but there's also an equilibrium and an accessibility. And what we're seeing now is actually, I think of it almost as the opposite of change, because it's a monoculture, and that's not diverse, and it's not about change. It's about cementing something that actually is not dynamic, but quite dead. Yeah.
I actually did want to, two things. First, respond to the woman who commented before about things that can be done. And I don't know if everyone knows about their local community boards, but every 2 years, any place that has a liquor license, comes up for renewal. You don't have to go in just to complain about places. If you've got an old bar that you love, you can go in and just say something good. That rarely happens, and it has a profound effect. We did that recently with a bar on the Upper East Side where I live, and it worked really well. And we kept the random complaints from holding up them renewing their liquor license. The second thing I wanted to more ask is that the theme or the problem, from my understanding, running for office is like our fast learning curve, and preservation and repair is the missing component of building the city. And I'm sure that's sort of obvious in a way, but on a lot of the boards, whether it's the the city council or it's in the local community boards, you have people who sit on these preservation and historic preservation boards, and they care about anything but preservation. They're actually coming from like a real estate background. They're coming from a development background. And there are no bylaws that say you must have this background in order to speak about it or to pass legislation on it. And so I wondered, one, if you'd become a scourge on your own community board by visiting them in their subcommittee on preservation, or if you had any conversations with people who are elected officials or anything that are in the preservation of the city.
Thank you for all that. I haven't really, because I mostly sit in my living room and blog alone. But I'm kind of an introvert, so I don't know about that part. But I'm going to be talking to Senator Brad Hoylman and some other folks. I mean, I'm hoping what I really want. I mean, my sort of dream of once things settle down for me, I really want to have a big conference, and I want to get people together because there's so much information that people have that I don't know this stuff, but there's so many people who do, and I want people to come together, you know, from across the boroughs who have this knowledge to share it with each other. I mean, there's got to be a way to do that. So that's kind of my back burner thing that I want to do. Yeah.
Do you have any instinct on what's going on with all the vacancies in New York, all the empty buildings, empty retail? Is there any chance that there might reach a tipping point where the rents are so low that maybe mom and pop stores and entrepreneurial stores will return?
Yeah, you're talking about high rent blight. Yeah. You know, I don't feel optimistic that the rents are going to go that low, that I think they're going to go low enough for the chains to want to come back. Brad Hoylman is actually, he wants to have a vacancy tax, which I think is a great idea. They do that in London, where so landlords are warehousing these empty spaces. The other thing, somebody has to get on this. I don't know how to do it, but I read that banks will basically decrease the property value of your building if you have a small business in it. And they'll increase the property values if you have a chain in it. So to me, that's class discrimination on the part of the banks. There's got to be some way to fight that. But that's one piece that's behind it.
So thank you all for such an interesting and important conversation. And Jeremiah will stick around and sign copies of his book, and I hope you will too, Amy Rose. Thank you all for being here.